In the last video lecture, we explored the domestic agenda and policies of the Reagan administration. And if you were with us, you know that this ended with the election in 1988 of George Herbert Walker Bush, the vice president during the Reagan years. This is going to complete the Reagan dynasty. Today, what we're going to talk about would be the foreign policy that we see enacted in the Reagan administration throughout the 1980s. And in ways, we're going to see the end of the Cold War. I don't know if you remember me talking about détente, a foreign policy that's really going to emerge under Richard Nixon. It's going to continue into Jimmy Carter's years. But generally speaking, this relaxation of tension in the Cold War it could best be described as a peaceful coexistence with communism. Reagan, and many conservatives like Reagan, really disagreed with this idea of détente. They didn't want to peacefully coexist with the Soviets. They wanted to defeat the Soviets. And Reagan said as much in speech after speech, especially early on in his presidency. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and he vowed to throw it on the ash heap of history. What I really mean by that is that Reagan is going to abandon the policies of Richard Nixon, of Jimmy Carter, of Gerald Ford, of some of his predecessors, and he's really going to mobilize to not only match the Soviet strengths, but actually to destroy them in the process. Okay. There's a lot of similarities between the administrations of John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan when it comes to foreign policy in the Cold War, right? Let me explain. If you think all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, and in particular the Teddy Roosevelt years, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine pretty much gave the United States the authority and the power to do whatever we wanted, almost whenever we wanted, anywhere in the Caribbean, and we did again and again and again. Okay? In the Central American country of Nicaragua, we had seen the establishment of a brutal dictator regime that comes to be known as the Somoza government. And by the 1930s, people in Nicaragua had had enough. And under the leadership of Augusto Cesar Sandino, you begin to see a resistance movement. Now, we're going to basically do our best to make sure that that resistance movement never really is successful in overthrowing the Somoza government, primarily because that government is very warm to American foreign policy in that part of the world. Decades go by, and by 1979, people of Nicaragua had had enough. An organization that comes to be known as the Sandinistas, a new resistance movement led by a guy that you're looking at on Time magazine down there, a guy by the name of Daniel Ortega, is going to not only overthrow the Somoza government, but they're going to establish a socialist regime in the Central American country. This is 1979, and Reagan is campaigning for the presidency at that particular moment. Now, he's going to have his undivided attention by the time that he is inaugurated as president. Nicaragua is going to really occupy his attention, and he's going to try as best he can to oust the Sandinista government and rid the Western Hemisphere of this socialistic threat. Before we can talk about that, guys, there's a few other things that I need to make clear for all of this to sort of add up in your own mind. In Nicaragua, there was this group that was calling themselves the Contras, right? And they opposed the Sandinista government. They were anti-socialists, and if given the chance, that they would oust that socialist regime. Simultaneously, Congress is going to pass a law called the Boland Amendment. This is very, very important. All the Boland Amendment really says is that if the president wants to take the country into any kind of military affair, he's going to need congressional approval. In other words, you have to go through the formality of declaring war. It's not as simple as just taking us into a police action, right? Obviously, where Congress is headed for this is, on the one hand, preventing another Vietnam, and on the other hand, preventing Ronald Reagan from going into Nicaragua without actually having to prove just cause, right? Now, I want to put a pin in Nicaragua here for a second. We'll come back to the Contras. We'll come back to the Western Hemisphere. But for right now, I want to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. We see a Muslim extremist group that is known as Hamas take American prisoners during about this same time. Ronald Reagan, better than anybody else, knew how badly that could destroy a presidency. As a matter of fact, it is probably one of the leading reasons that he was elected president, because Jimmy Carter just never had any answer for that issue when he was president in Iran, right? And so Reagan understands he needs to do everything within his power to free those American hostages. So he reaches out to Hamas's main national ally within the region, and that would be Iran. Now, it's Ronald Reagan who campaigned in a very strong foreign policy, the idea that we needed to get back to being the #1 power in the world again, reaching out to a sworn enemy within the region, and that'd be the Iranian government. Okay? Nothing illegal about it, but it doesn't exactly scream patriotism, so to speak. What Reagan asks for is help, Iran to help us free those hostages. And Iran agrees, but keep in mind, they're not going to do this out of the kindness of their hearts. They want something for it. What they want is to buy American missile systems. Understand that selling Iran missile systems is not illegal. It doesn't do anything as far as the Boland Amendment is concerned. But I do want you to understand, we sold the Iranian government missile systems in exchange for their help freeing the hostages. They do help us, and the hostages are free. So game over, right? Keep in mind, we were paid for those missiles. And what we use that money for, that is what becomes the subject of controversy in what will come to be known as the Iran-Contra Affair. That money comes back to Nicaragua, and we funnel it through special operatives into the Contras. And keep in mind, they oppose the Sandinista government, the people that are trying to oust the socialists in that Central American country. That is a clear-cut violation of the Boland Amendment, that it is a military exercise as far as Congress is concerned. And if we know that the president commissioned it, that could very well be an impeachable offense. The man that you're looking at on the screen there is Colonel Oliver North, and he's testifying in front of the Senate. And ultimately, his testimony is going to implicate higher-ups within the Reagan administration. What did the president know, and when did the president know it? That's what the press would like to know. And so they just point-blank asked him, Mr. President, did you know about this? Now, in 1980, Ronald Reagan is going to be the oldest man to ever be inaugurated. In 2016, Donald Trump would replace him as the oldest president to ever take the oath of office. Now, what Reagan is going to say is essentially not a very satisfying answer. He's going to say, I don't remember, okay? And that was a deeply unsatisfying answer. But you have to understand, even as late as 1986, America, including the press, was still very much smitten by Ronald Reagan. He had a lot of charm. It was not for no good reason that he was referred to as the great communicator, right? And so we kind of took him at face value. If he says he can't remember, he's an older guy, I guess he can't remember. It's going to lead his critics to call him the Teflon president because nothing ever stuck to him, right? The Iran-Contra Affair, the idea of taking money from Iran and funneling it into Nicaragua to more or less play the role of kingmaker in Central America, this is going to be a very controversial issue, but much like Franklin Roosevelt and the court-packing crisis, it's not really going to result in too much of a political cost for the Reagan administration or even the Republican Party in the aftermath of its playing out. For right now, I want to get back to this whole issue of Reagan and the Soviet Union. It's often said that Ronald Reagan purposefully got the Soviet Union involved in an arms race that they could not afford. The idea was, let's spend them into their own graves. What we'll do is we'll reinvigorate this arms race. We'll build missiles and hydrogen bombs and nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers and new planes, and you get the idea. And because the Soviets are going to be our main rival in this Cold War, they're going to have to spend that money to keep up with us. The only problem is that the Soviet Union, on its best day, can't even get in the same zip code as the American economy. Are we going to go into debt? No question about it, but we can afford to absorb that debt much, much better than the Soviet Union is able to. And so therefore, what people that tell you that it was really Ronald Reagan that won the Cold War, the way that they're going to base this assessment is by getting the Soviets involved in this arms race that ultimately broke their economic backs. It's a very important issue. It's certainly a causation, factor in the causation, but it entirely ignores the issue of the internal dynamics within the Soviet Union. The fact of the matter was, the Soviet Union had gotten itself into its own Vietnam, and that was Afghanistan. And unlike America, that emerges from Vietnam not unscathed, the Soviet Union really doesn't ever really, truly reemerge from Afghanistan, right? More of that in just a minute. But for right now, I want to talk about this arms race on the American side and the impact that it's going to play in the American economy. At the same time that he approved a 10% across the board income tax reduction, Reagan also called for a 20% increase in military spending. Let me say that again. We're doubling our military budget at the same time that we're reducing the amount of money that we're taking in. It's during the Reagan years that you begin to see these horror stories of Pentagon spending. It was said that it reached its absolute nadir, low point, with $34 million per hour. And Reagan is going to take an awful lot of heat for this particular policy. And in particular, his critics like to point to what Reagan called the Strategic Defense Initiative. Reagan did not like this idea that we were using to guard against nuclear annihilation, mutually assured destruction. You launch a missile at us, we will launch a missile at you, we will destroy the world. That's how we're preventing World War III and nuclear annihilation from happening. He was also an older gentleman, but he had heard of outer space, and he was thinking that maybe we could launch one of these satellites into outer space. And every time that we saw, a missile coming across the Atlantic, the satellite, which would be armed with lasers, would be able to shoot it down, and it would fall harmlessly into the ocean. Right? It was a great idea. It really was. I mean, in ways, it was before its time. The only problem is it's 1984, and that kind of technology doesn't exist, and it won't exist for decades into the future. But we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars on SDI, and it would lead critics of the Reagan administration to call it Star Wars, because at the end of the day, what it was science fiction. We're going to run up massive amounts of debt. I mean, again, this is one of the reasons that Reagan is going to have so much trouble when it comes to not only balancing the budget, but also the deficits ballooning so quickly and so massively all of a sudden, right? At the same time, it is going to make the Soviet Union try to keep up with us, and ultimately they're not able to do so. Soviet Union. By the late 1980s, it was being run by hardliners that were kind of missing the forest for the trees here. The Soviet economy, primarily because it was deeply locked into this arms race with the Soviet Union, is going to go broke. I mean, there's some real bread and butter concerns that the Soviet people are facing. And that's not good. If you recall, that's ultimately what brought communism to Russia in the first place. The guy that's running the Soviet Union at this particular moment is a pragmatist. He's a real practical kind of guy by the name of Mikhail Gorbachev, right? And what Gorbachev tries to do is really light a fire under these Soviet bureaucrats. He begins to implement a process that comes to be known as perestroika, right? Russian for open discussions. And ultimately, these open discussions are being taken in the bloc in Eastern Europe, in places like Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia. And he's putting this to a vote. Do you want to be part of the Soviet Union any longer, or would you like your independence? Would you like to be free and your own country? And in Poland, and in Czechoslovakia, and in Hungary, they voted with their feet and they left. They said, no, we don't want this. And Gorbachev doesn't stop this from happening. Glasgow's open discussion. This is really going to be the final straw in Eastern Germany. And that's where Ronald Reagan is going to come to Berlin. And with the Berlin Wall behind him, he's going to reach out directly to Mikhail Gorbachev, saying that if you believe in peace and if you believe that you need to bring prosperity to your people, then, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And that's exactly what you see happen in 1988, 1989. The wall came down. And the Berlin Wall, if you remember, was the symbol of Soviet repression. And so it's much more complicated than Reagan spent them into their own demise. Certainly that was a big part of this, but there are internal workings in the Soviet Union that simply cannot be ignored. Gorbachev actually starts this process himself, and when he sees what's going on here, that they're leaving in Poland and Czechoslovakia, he doesn't stop it from happening, right? A couple years later, in 1992, the Soviet Union would fall through a military coup. And what comes out of this coup is the modern day country that you call Russia, right? Communism failed. It fails in the Soviet Union, it fails in Eastern Europe, and ultimately the United States is going to emerge from this Cold War as the lone superpower. Cold War is over. I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty crazy considering we've been talking about this in some form or fashion in class after class after class after class, and here we are at the end of the road. It's over, right? We are the lone superpower, but I don't want you to get the idea that our hegemony, our position within the world, is somehow not challenged. Ronald Reagan, like many presidents before him, certainly many presidents after him, is never really going to have too much success brokering peace in the Middle East. For example, in 1983, Reagan is going to send troops into the Middle Eastern country of Lebanon simply to keep both sides from killing each other. And it's in Lebanon that we're going to see the first glimpses of what would later become known as a suicide bomber. The image of at the top of that PowerPoint slide there is the immediate aftermath of a dump truck that was driven by a suicide bomber and slammed itself and detonated a massive bomb into the Marine barracks that were just simply there to keep the peace. And so this peace brokering campaign in Beirut, Lebanon, ultimately failed and Reagan called the troops back home. This is a post-Vietnam era, and the American people are far less likely, far less willing to see American blood shed on foreign soil. 1980, war is going to break out in the Middle East between Iran and its rival within the region, Iraq. We knew who was running Iraq. We knew that it was a brutal dictator by the name of Saddam Hussein, who had used biological and chemical weapons on his own people. And we still funneled both military and financial aid into Iraq, considering that to be the lesser of two evils. That if Iraq was to emerge victorious, that would weaken our main enemy in the region, at least in the 1980s, which happened to be Iran. And so, as you might imagine, this is going to create quite a controversial opinion in the Muslim world, in the Middle Eastern world, when it comes to American presence. And all of this is going to fall onto the shoulders of a guy that we've talked about, the guy that's going to win the election of 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush. Now, let me make something clear. If this presidency is going to be a referendum on foreign policy, this is the guy that you want in the Oval Office. Before Bush was vice president, which, let's be honest, came with lots and lots of foreign policy experience, he was a senator, and he served on dozens and dozens of senatorial committees involving foreign policy. Before he was a senator, he was also the director of the CIA. And so, as you might imagine, this guy has a lot of experience when it comes to foreign policy. Now, the big challenge is going to come via Iraq. And Saddam Hussein is going to invade his oil-rich neighbor to the south, Kuwait. And a lot of this has to do with not only becoming the preeminent power within the region, a lot of it has to do with its oil reserves. What Bush is going to do is issue an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein: leave Kuwait, liberate it, or else. What we call this is Operation Desert Storm. And the whole point of Desert Storm is to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation, and we do. Not only is this very successful from a military perspective, it's short, it's clean, it's decisive, and we had an international coalition of countries behind us. It's not Vietnam when we were going this alone. We have the support of the Germans and the Swedes and the French. We also have a lot of Muslim world countries that are on board with this as well. Saddam had to leave. If he doesn't leave, he's going to face military consequences. There's such a euphoric celebration in the United States in 1991 when Saddam Hussein does agree to leave the country that it prompted George Bush to say, we finally kicked that Vietnam syndrome. Bush became a very popular president, even though we don't ultimately march to Baghdad and take out Saddam Hussein. More of that for another lecture, but for right now, I want to talk about the demise of George Herbert Walker Bush. That's going to be the economy. Bush is going to be in a very similar position of Herbert Hoover in 1929. Those chickens had ultimately come home to roost, right? Massive budget deficits, lingering problems within the American economy involving an unequal distribution of the wealth. Ultimately, this is going to take its toll, and it's going to come crashing down in 1992, which just so happened to be an election year, right? At this point, Bush has a decision to make. You can do nothing, like Herbert Hoover did nothing, and watch the economy sink into what a lot of economists are saying is the Great Depression 2.0. Or you can do something, unlike Herbert Hoover. You can raise taxes. You can raise taxes on the very top ends of the American economy and save it. Give George Bush a lot of credit because that's exactly what he does. It just so happens to be political poison. This is going to be deeply upsetting to those people that supported George Bush, especially the Republican base. Remember, he had promised no new taxes, and here he is at the end of his first term raising taxes. And ultimately, what it's going to do is it's going to pave the way for a relatively unknown name in American politics at the time, a guy by the name of Bill Clinton, to become president in 1992. Clinton portrayed himself as a different type of Democrat. What he meant by that is somebody that could unite this broken and splintered political coalition that once upon a time called itself the New Deal Coalition. 1992 is about the economy. Make no mistake about that. And if it's about the economy, then that's going to mean that George Bush is really going to be at a disadvantage. Bush was an institution. His father was a senator. He came from a very well-to-do family. It's very unlikely that the American people are going to buy this idea that he gets it. Bill Clinton, on the other hand, was from Hope, Arkansas. And he was, no disrespect to Hope or Arkansas, but it wasn't exactly, the place where presidents were born. Very middle-class background, okay? He himself had a very middle-class background. He is going to go in front of the American people and proclaim that he feels their pain. And because a lot of people saw a lot of themselves in Bill Clinton, they bought it. They believed in him. And this is going to win him a lot of acclaim. He's going to team up with a senator from Tennessee, a guy by the name of Al Gore. And together, what they're going to do is they're going to put together an all-Southern, all-baby boomer ticket that will campaign on a pro-middle class platform. The guy in the middle there, I'm going to mouse over so you can see exactly who I'm talking about. This individual right here. We know this is Clinton. We know this is Bush. At the town hall meeting, you can see the splintering of the Republican Party. The man in the middle there is Texas billionaire Ross Perot, who was never very kind to George H.W. Bush. Perot is going to enter the race as an independent, but for all intents and purposes, he's a conservative, he's a Republican. And Perot is also going to, really go on the attack when it comes to George Herbert Walker Bush causing this recession. And Bush tried to dismiss him at town hall meetings like the one that you're looking at right there. You don't have any experience. You might be a good businessman, Perot, but you've got no experience. And Perot, sharp as a tack, would come right back and say, you're right, George, I don't have any experience in running up a $2 trillion debt. That one's you. That's all you, right? And so clearly what the Republicans are going to do in 92 is split their vote, right? To make this clear, if you're looking at that map there, it looks like a very blue map. But looks can be deceiving. Clinton's only going to win 43% of the popular vote. But even though it's not a majority, It was more than enough to carry him to victory in the Electoral College because Perot is splitting his vote with George Herbert Walker Bush. Bill Clinton will win the White House. The Democrats will be back in the White House after wandering in the political wilderness. I want you to make something very clear, though. Clinton won the 1992 race, but he made very powerful enemies in the process. Enemies that felt that he was not qualified to be president, and enemies that vowed to everything within their power to make him a one-term president. You'll see what I mean in the next lecture. For right now, that's where I want to end.